500 videos on this channel! Yay! I really wasn't sure of exactly how to celebrate hitting this milestone. It's not exactly me that's hit it, it's you guys, really. So I asked you guys on Twitter and my YouTube community on what I should do, and most of you said, make a video about something you love! Helpful. Guys, yeah. Sarcasm! Okay, so here's a question. What do I love? Well, I love animation, that's obvious. I also love annoying people by talking about controversial subjects I don't 100% understand or fully relate to. Actually, I like annoying people in general. But there is something else I love for reasons that still confuse me to this day as to exactly why it still exists. Seriously, why haven't The Simpsons been cancelled yet? Yeah, we're going to talk about The Simpsons again. It isn't exactly considered controversial now, but it's responsible for breaking a lot of barriers in mainstream television. Not just in animated sitcoms, but it's changed American television and perhaps worldwide television in more ways than people realise, presenting the typical Caucasian American male stereotype and exaggerating it and other stereotypes to the point of extreme silliness, and yeah, it annoys and offends a lot of people. Even to this day. But everyone is a target. Everyone is targeted, no matter what race, nationality, age, or gender. Everyone is equally attacked. That's the philosophy of the show. But perhaps the 13th episode of season 5 is the most controversial, or at least it is now. Not because of what happens in the episode or anything, but because of how people love to pretend to be offended by things that have not really been a problem for 30 years. Until now, apparently. Did you know that the character Apu in The Simpsons was the only Asian Indian character in a TV sitcom made for American television for the first 5 years of the 90s? Or perhaps the correct phrase would be, no one who actually had a complaint about Apu was actually listened to because they didn't have a platform until now. But I wonder if they have that platform now as a result of their ethnic minority being represented in a primetime television show at a time where that was an incredibly rare thing. The power the audience has over what is created and how certain characters are depicted is at the point where the audience is pretty close to spiraling into Anne Wilkes levels of creative control. You know, the crazy fangirl from Stephen King's Misery. Of course, as culture changes, so does art. But these changes should happen organically, not forced upon the creators because they're being controversial or, you know, things are not anywhere near close to your fan fiction you wrote. But what if a character is written out of a show entirely as a result of what I'll call the Wilkes syndrome? Let's talk about that for a moment, shall we? Yeah, sorry, bear with me here. I will get to the episode eventually. Okay, so accurate and respectful representation of your race and nationality in media is something everyone is entitled to, and I think a lot of us Caucasians take that for granted. Everyone is also entitled to voicing their concerns as to how their race and or nationality is portrayed in media. Why? Because how your race or nationality is portrayed in media can have an adverse effect on how you are treated by others if you are an ethnic minority or come from an eccentric culture or nationality. For example, a character like Apu probably had and is still having an adverse effect on how Indian people are treated in Western culture. However, this does not make you exempt from the consequences of expressing your opinion or saying something offends you. Trust me, I know. Being Scottish, my nationality is constantly depicted in a negative light. But that's nationality, not race. But this video isn't about nationality, it's more about how minority races are, or have been depicted, or rather how counterproductive it is to write out a minority character to avoid the controversy they caused. Obviously, I can't say forthright whether or not Apu is an offensive stereotype because I'm not Asian or of Indian descent, and I'm guessing not everyone who is Asian or Indian descent would find this character offensive. In some cases, it's more than justified to remove characters if they are depicted in a negative light, the best example being the centaur from Fantasia. But removing the character or writing out a character from a show or movie may do more damage to the product than we realise. Hey, I have a question. Since when were the creators of The Simpsons worried about controversy? Wasn't the whole philosophy of The Simpsons based on being controversial towards everyone equally? Yeah, I know what you're thinking. I'm taking things far too seriously. The Simpsons is just a cartoon. It's just a joke. Lighten up, right? You know what? It's that attitude that has probably prevented anyone who was offended by Apu being heard for the last 30 years. But as I said, writing the character out of a show entirely is not the right way to go either, especially when remembering the episode Homer vs. Apu, which is my favourite Simpsons episode of all time. In this episode, Homer vs. Apu serves as vital character development for Apu, who is voiced by Hank Azaria. Diarrhea. Is it a white American basically impersonating an Indian man? Yes. Is it offensive to people of Indian descent? Well, that depends. But guess what? He also voices Carl Carlson, a character of African American descent. Somehow, as far as I know, this isn't considered offensive, other than the fact it's a white actor playing a black character in an animated sitcom. It's been said that Apu is just as racist and offensive as, say, blackface or brownface. So why isn't Carl Carlson offensive? Is this a double standard or just a coincidental irony? Probably a little of both. Like all characters Azaria plays, Apu is also based on an already existing source. Many convenience store clerks in LA are of Pakistani and Indian descent, and many convenience stores here in the UK are also owned by people of Asian descent. Apu was always intended to be stereotypical, but so were the entire cast of the show. Everyone is targeted, and yeah, some people will be offended by how their race or nationality is depicted, but everyone is targeted. But does that make it okay? Probably not. But why is this such a big deal now, after 30 years? Because of a comedian called Harry Kondabolu. Oh god, I hope I've said that name right. Kondabolu. Annunciation! Kondabolu went as far as making a 30-minute documentary about the character Apu named The Problem with Apu, made in 2018, 30 years after Apu made his first appearance. The documentary is quite an interesting watch and is more about Apu's acceptability as a character. Most of you are probably thinking, it's a joke, why is he taking it so seriously? And that right there, as I've already said, is why it took people like Kondabolu 30 years to be heard. Not 30 years to actually say they were offended, but it took them 30 years to be heard. As I pointed out earlier, I do wonder if Kondabolu would have had the platform he has now as a comedian if Apu never existed. Sadly, as far as I'm aware, since the documentary aired, Apu has not had a line or appeared in any Simpsons episode. Was this Kondabolu's intention? Who knows? Meanwhile, Groundskeeper Willie, a stereotypical Scottish man, is fine. I know a lot of you have been waiting for me to bring him up. Luigi Risotto, a stereotype of Italians, is also fine. Carl Carlson, who I've already brought up in this video, an African American character who is also played by a white man, is fine. B-Man, a Mexican, who is also played by a white American, is also fine. Akira, a stereotypical Japanese man, is also fine, who, by the way, was voiced by George Takei in the episode One Fish, Two Fish, Blowfish, Bluefish in the 11th episode of season 2, but has since been voiced by Hank Azaria since then. I keep changing from Azaria to Azaria. I wonder if people are finding that distracting. In fact, every other stereotype of race and nationality is fine, except Apu. Don't you love double standards? Seriously though, characters like Willie, Luigi, Akira and Apu started off as stock characters of stereotypes, and until this episode, Apu was just a stock character. I should mention that Homer himself is a walking stereotype of the typical white American man. The episode itself has a joke about how black people drive compared to how white people drive. So it's not just one race or nationality that's targeted, it's all of them. Are some targeted more than others in this show? Yeah, maybe, but that doesn't warrant writing a beloved character out of a show entirely. There have been many cultural shifts in the last 3 decades since Apu made his first appearance in the episode A Telltale Head, which aired in 1990. This was the 8th episode of season 1, so Apu didn't actually get much character development beyond the Pakistani man who worked in the convenience store until Homer vs. Apu, which aired in 1994, 5 seasons later. For a show like The Simpsons, it's not so much about poking fun at race, but rather at how some Caucasians perceive foreign races. It's new and exotic to them, so they don't know how to process it, so instead of making the effort to educate themselves to know and understand it, they instead make fun or attack it, because that's easier. That right there is the joke. And the Simpsons family, and Homer especially, really enjoys having Apu around and trying new things from Apu's culture. Removing Apu as a character is like saying he never existed in the first place. We never should have had this character in the first place, and casual racism in The Simpsons, or any show for that matter, ever happens. If you're going to do this, you should remove all the characters who aren't Caucasian to avoid controversy. But guess what? If you do this, that's called whitewashing. This is the censorship equivalent of brushing dust under a rug and pretending it's not there. I know this show is owned by 20th Century Fox, but if they want to be respected and taken seriously, they need to understand that episodes like this really are a product of their time. Yeah. 20th Century Fox is now owned by Disney, so I doubt this is going to happen anytime soon. Warner Brothers, though, has a disclaimer before a cartoon that depicts racist character designs. The quote is basically saying that the cartoons are a product of their time and depict ethnic racial prejudices that were commonplace in society. The cartoons are being represented as they were originally created because to do otherwise would be the same as claiming these prejudices never existed. Also, not to mention, it would cause irreparable damage to a piece of art. Instead of pretending they don't exist, they present them to the public and explain why certain content and behaviour is wrong. With all that aside, this episode provides us with a brilliant commentary on the nightmares of retail work. One of the reasons why it is my favourite episode. Retail work is hell. I have had 14 different jobs since the age of 14, and the majority of them were retail, and they were hell. From unreliable or inconsistent hours to low pay, dealing with rude or obnoxious customers, retail is one of the most stressful jobs out there, next to perhaps waiting tables. Obviously, I am not saying retail is more stressful as working in the armed forces or the emergency services, but for a frame of reference here, retail can either be incredibly stressful or mind-numbingly boring, and we see how the stress of this affects Apu. But we also see a character carry out what we all wish we could do when working in retail. The episode opens with Apu going a step too far in pulling the wool over his customers' eyes. Of course, the only person dumb enough to actually fall for this and eat expired meat that Apu puts on the shelf is Homer Simpson. After being briefly hospitalised, he goes back to the KwikEMart to confront Apu about this. Apu apologises, and as a peace offering, he gives Homer a bucket of what he says is frozen shrimp. Homer points out that it's clearly not frozen and smells funny, so Apu gives him another bucket, which Homer accepts, and ends up being sick again. But what's more hilarious is watching Apu finding ways to entertain himself while also taking advantage of stupid customers, which, let's face it, is something all convenience store clerks wish they could do. True, Apu goes too far in this episode, but he knows within the first 30 seconds of the episode he has, so it's kind of Homer's fault that he gets sick. But yeah, Apu keeps getting away with it, and Homer is an idiot. That doesn't make it okay, but it just makes it very entertaining. Apu is a character whose identity is wrapped up in the KwikEMart. Without the KwikEMart prior to this episode, we don't really know who he is other than a walking, talking stereotype. Does this episode fix that? well, of course not. But we get vital character development, placing him as the lead in the episode, which was quite a rare thing back then. Apu taking advantage of Homer's stupidity seems to be more than just a matter of money. It's just so damn entertaining for Apu, and for us by extension. On one hand, we need to side with Homer here, but on the other, working in a convenience store can be so mind-numbingly boring. So finding ways to be entertained to pass the time, because a lot of retail workers work 8 to 12 hours a day, sometimes more, often comes from the expense of the dumbest customers. That doesn't justify what Apu is doing, but we understand why he's doing it. After Homer gets sick twice, Lisa encourages him to blow the whistle on the KwikEMart. He goes undercover while wearing a tiny camera that fits inside an oversized novelty hat. It's 1994, GoPro cameras weren't a thing yet. We get a pretty cool shot seen from the camera itself as Homer goes inside the KwikEMart while being stared down by Apu. Okay, so Apu isn't doing this out of malice, and I think Homer's really doing this because he was nudged to do it by his daughter. And really, Homer doesn't want Apu to lose his job. In fact, I don't think he's 100% aware of what he's actually doing. He just wants justice, but he's so lazy and unfocused he can't even resist still eating food from Apu's store, even after it made him sick twice. Yeah, that's how dumb Homer Simpson is. I honestly feel that Apu simply wants to find ways to pass the time, and Homer is so gullible and impulsive, Apu doesn't even need to move from behind the counter to make Homer fall for his tricks. While not realizing he is under surveillance though, after Homer leaves the store, Apu drops a hot dog which rolls right into the lens of the novelty hat camera that Homer smashes, after Apu tricks him into thinking the buzzing noise of the camera is a bee inside his hat. The hot dog gets covered in filth and grime, but Apu decides to sell it anyway, knowing someone like Homer would fall for it. And he does. Yeah. Apu is fired from the KwikEMart and blames Homer. He goes to his house and looks as if he's going to kill him. Instead, though, he explains the pose he's doing is a traditional pose of apology from his village. Yeah, okay, that part was pretty racist. But Apu is offering to pay off his debt to Homer, blaming himself for being fired instead of Homer, taking responsibility for becoming complacent while working at the KwikEMart. And because Homer is a dumbass, and still sees Apu as just the KwikEMart guy, he thinks Apu is trying to sell him something. Apu says he is selling the balance of karmic realignment. And Homer says karma can only be portioned out by the cosmos and slams the door in his face. Sometimes Homer's intelligence is increased for the convenience of the plot. Gee, I wonder who that reminds me of. That right there has now put Apu in a place where he is no longer just a convenience store clerk or background character. His entire identity until now was with the KwikEMart, but now we can see what he's like out with the KwikEMart. We get vital character development for him. Is Apu a workaholic? Well, no. A workaholic is a person who compulsively works excessively hard and long hours. Apu doesn't work hard. He works long hours, yes, but he doesn't work hard. Apu is a man ruled by convention, commitment, and tradition, but he's also a man who enjoys ripping off idiots. And who could blame him when they're so dumb like Homer Simpson is? The KwikEMart isn't a job to him. It's a solemn existential calling. So when he's fired, it's not so much a dismissal as much as an execution. And he goes and pretends to attempt to kill himself by eating one of his own hot dogs. While Apu is paying off his debt to the Simpsons at their house, the KwikEMart managers are interviewing various people to replace Apu. First up is Barney Gumbo, who of course doesn't get the job. And then the Lord of the Dead, actor James Woods himself, applies for the job. Why? Because he's researching a role for a character he wants to play who happens to be a tightly round convenience store clerk. Let's face it, the job of a convenience store clerk is lonely and people often ignore you or are rude to you. I've been one several times, so know firsthand how horrible working in a convenience store can be. So seeing James Woods refusing to be treated badly, even though he technically wasn't being harassed or anything, but he's just channeling the frustrations all us retail workers have experienced, while also being able to express what we want to do to certain customers. But the beauty here is that he is still walking the tightrope of sanity and insanity. He's on the verge of snapping. He's constantly on the brink of exploding, and when he does, it's inside a microwave while he's scraping the cheese off of it. He is quick to get back to being more or less a level-headed guy. And that really makes the episode really entertaining and makes, you know, the mundane scenes in the KwikEMart really stand out compared to the rest of the episode. Okay, fangirl moment here. If Hades from Disney Hercules was a convenience store clerk, admit it, you'd shop there all the time. Though he'd probably get you to sell your soul to him for a donut. And Homer would probably fall for that. Apu cannot go back to the KwikEMart because, in his words, that's the scene of my spiritual depantsing. So instead, Marge and Apu go shopping at a Monstro Mart, a soulless giant of a store. You know, think about going from Tesco's in the UK and hopping into a Walmart in America. It's that kind of difference in size. Why are American stores so big? In fact, why is everything in America so giant? Or maybe everything just seems giant to me because I'm only 5'1". Later, after doing many favours for the Simpsons, including raking their yard and cooking dinner for them and, assisting Homer in the shower, I think, he sings a song about who needs the KwikEMart. Yeah, Apu is clearly in denial and lies through song. Don't you hate it when that happens? Anyway, Homer and Apu go to India, where the head office for KwikEMart is based, so that Apu can ask for his job back. The very first KwikEMart is more like a temple for a hermit rather than a head office, which is ingenious. However, they can only ask 3 questions, and before Apu can even ask for his job back, Homer asks if the man in front of them is really the head of the KwikEMart 3 times, and wastes all 3 questions. So Apu leaves, defeated, and the two end up fighting on the mountainside. So yeah, the whole segment of the episode where Homer and Apu go to India to ask for Apu's job back is rendered pointless after Homer asks the 3 questions. Again, it wasn't out of malice, Homer is just a dumbass. I do wonder why they didn't just, walk back inside, because, the guru did say, "Thank you, come again," but then that nearly wouldn't have been as entertaining. Cut back to Springfield after they journey home, and Apu decides to face his demons by going to the KwikEMart by himself. There, James Woods praises him for being a legend in retail, and we get the best joke about the horrors of working in retail ever aired on television, at least American television anyway. After apparently working 96 hours straight, Apu thinks he's a hummingbird of some kind. And of course, because he's a slave to his trade, James Woods has been watching the surveillance tapes of Apu working and conveniently has the tape right at that point to play. Because comedy. Then someone who isn't Snake attempts to rob the KwikEMart and tells them not to try any funny stuff. The robber aims his gun at James Woods and Apu leaps in front of him, being shot in the chest. While in hospital, James tells Apu he got him his job back at the KwikEMart, and the episode ends with the Simpsons hugging Apu. Congratulations, Apu, you got the screaming kiss of hot lead and vital character development, which may or may not have resulted in you becoming one of the most beloved Simpsons characters in the show. What a shame you've been written out. The Simpsons has been airing for 30 years, and mainstream television was far different in the early 90s. This episode was aired in 1994. This doesn't justify racist or offensive content, but these shows and cartoons need to be presented as they were originally created. Why? Because taking them off the air or writing out characters that may seem offensive is like pretending these prejudices never existed in the first place. Knowing you have a problem is only the first step. Hiding it, or pretending it doesn't exist, or writing out a character to avoid controversy doesn't erase the problem. If anything, it makes it worse. You're just erasing a mistake instead of correcting it. This episode is one of the best Simpsons episodes because of the pacing, the comedy, the character development, and of course one of the best guest stars ever. Will the problem with Apu ever cease to be problematic? No, but it won't stop this episode from being my favourite episode of The Simpsons either. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. In the meantime, be marvellous to each other, and I'm Mad Munchkin, stay creative.